So what are the differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells? These are very important to know for our purposes. Eukaryotic cells, as a reminder, are those that include animal cells, fungal cells, plant cells, as well as some other things like protists, which we probably won't talk about very much in this class. Prokaryotic cells include bacteria and archaea. The groups of organisms that have prokaryotic cells are only bacteria and archaea. Again, these are not most closely related to one another, which I talk about in a different video, but they are the only two groups which have prokaryotic cells. Let us talk about what these cell types have in common and what is different between them. Eukaryotic cells are cells that have membrane-bound compartments. That is the number one thing to remember about eukaryotic cells. So if I've drawn the cell membrane here around the outside of the cell, then we will also see things such as a nucleus where the DNA would be found. The nucleus has a membrane. We would also see things like mitochondria. Mitochondria have a membrane. We would see the endoplasmic reticulum, which is made up of membranes, as well as the Golgi apparatus. All these things are membrane-bound compartments, which just means that you have some kind of contained or some kind of separated area within a membrane. And so imagine a cell membrane, something very similar to that, with our lipid bilayer, and just a smaller version of that. I'm not going to draw it all perfectly here, but what I'm trying to show is that we can have a bilayer, and then we could have an interior, which is here, and the interior is completely separate from the rest of the cytoplasm, which would be out here in the cell. So this is a compartment that is surrounded by its own membrane, membrane-bound compartment. And we call most of these an organelle. And again, this is important because now we could have, for example, a different pH inside of this compartment than we have outside in the rest of the cytoplasm. Or we might have a higher concentration of a certain type of enzyme inside of this compartment. And this is one of the reasons why eukaryotic cells are able to do a lot of different things, and they're often able to live in many different environments under different conditions. That is, the same particular cell might live under many different conditions. Now let's also talk for a moment about plant cells, because we are going to see something similar, or a similarity between plant cells and prokaryotic cells. Or actually, let's come to that in a moment. So now for our prokaryotic cells, I want to make sure that we know that this is not to scale. So our prokaryotic cells are often rod-shaped or ovular, and they have a cell membrane, and then they also have a cell wall. Oops. and the cell wall is outside of the cell membrane. Now there are different types of arrangements, and it doesn't always look exactly like this, but I'm simplifying it for now. Actually, I should have switched the colors there. Oh man, I'm gonna fail my kindergarten coloring test. Okay, so we have the cell membrane, same color as the eukaryotic cell, and then we are going to have the cell wall, which is not present in the eukaryotic cell, and that is on the outside of the cell membrane. It surrounds the cell membrane. So we have both a cell wall and a cell membrane in the prokaryote, but not in the eukaryote. In the eukaryote, we only have the cell membrane. This is the cell wall. Also, in prokaryotic cells, we have DNA. The area where the DNA, or the space that the DNA occupies, is called the nucleoid region. Now, in some cells, in some micrographs, you're going to see that that is basically the entire inside of the cell. And sometimes it's more condensed and it's only in one region of the cell. But we'll show it here. It occupies a large proportion of the cell oftentimes. So that is similar to eukaryotic cells as well, except for in eukaryotic cells, the DNA is, of course, contained within the nucleus. But what we might be starting to notice here is that there are no membrane-bound compartments in the prokaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells do not have any organelles. They do not have any separated areas inside of the cell that have a different environment, a different pH, or a different concentration of salt or enzymes. So inside of the prokaryotic cell, in the cytoplasm, it's largely the same. And that is the biggest difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Prokaryotes have no membrane-bound compartments. However, they do have a couple of things that in common with eukaryotic cells. They do have ribosomes, so ribosomes are quite small. Sometimes you could see them under a microscope. I'll just draw them here. They're scattered throughout the cell. Eukaryotic cells also have ribosomes. They're a little bit different, but strikingly similar, and we could talk more about why that is later in the course. And of course, there are things such as the building blocks of proteins, which are, of course, amino acids. We have carbohydrates, we have nucleic acids in the cell, in the cytoplasm of the prokaryotes as well, but we don't have any other really distinguishing characteristics inside of the cell. Outside, or on the exterior of the cell, we can have a couple of different features depending on what bacterium we're talking about, and these are the flagellum. So we can have a flagellum, which can be quite long. It can help with movement. You could have more than one flagella, again, depending on the bacterial species. And these are long extensions that are connected to the interior of the cell, so they're kind of rooted, so to speak, in the cytoplasm. And then something similar, but not the same, are cilia. And so cilia, or sorry, not cilia, pillae. So you've probably heard the term cilia before. Pillae are very similar to cilia, but they are distinct because they are unique to bacteria. So again, these are short extensions that might help with movement. And these pillae, and then, so that's plural, and the singular is pillis. This is the same as pillae. You could say either. These are used for either movement, or they could also be used for exchanging genetic information. Surprising, right? Again, we'll talk more about that later. Oh, and I did want to label this. This is flagella. And the singular is flagellum. Okay. The one other thing that I'm going to mention on the interior of the cell is that bacteria can have some things. They're not organelles, but they're called inclusions. So they are kind of conglomerations or aggregations, that's a better word, aggregations of certain types of molecules. So you might have lots of a certain type of enzyme in this clump. They're all bound together. But what's the difference between an inclusion and an organelle? An organelle, like a mitochondria, is surrounded by a membrane. So organelle. At least for our purposes, organelles refer to something with a membrane, whereas inclusions, no membrane. So again, inclusions are characteristic only of bacteria, which do not have organelles. Eukaryotic cells have organelles, but they don't have inclusions. Those are the major differences between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. The one last thing that I want to show is the difference in size between bacterial cells and eukaryotic cells, or prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So again, the term prokaryotic encompasses both bacteria and archaea, whereas if I said bacteria, that leaves out archaea. But this difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells applies to both bacteria and archaea. And that is that in general, our eukaryotic cells are about 100 times larger or more than a prokaryotic cell. And you're going to see this under the microscope. And I think that I have a slide somewhere that shows a bacterial cell that is actually right next to a human cheek cell, and you can see the size difference. And so again, prokaryotic cells, whether it be bacteria or archaea, are much, much smaller than eukaryotic cells in general. And then if we're talking about viruses, viruses are even smaller than that. They're comparatively much, much smaller than a prokaryotic cell.